The man history would remember as Ivan the Terrible was not born a monster, he was made into one. His early years were steeped in betrayal, humiliation, and violence, shaping him into a ruler whose very name would become synonymous with cruelty. When Ivan IV was just 3 years old, his father, Grand Prince Vasily III, died unexpectedly, leaving the throne to a boy barely old enough to speak. 5 years later, his mother, Elena Glinskaya, mysteriously perished, poisoned, many believe, by the very nobles who sought to control Russia. Orphaned and vulnerable, the young prince was left in the hands of the powerful boyar families, who saw him not as a future ruler, but as a pawn to be manipulated. What followed was a childhood that could twist the soul of any man. The boyars, the ruling aristocracy, humiliated the child ruler at every turn. They stole from the royal treasury, feasted while he starved, and in moments of drunken amusement, they beat him for sport. Ivan IV was forced to watch as his loyal servants were slaughtered before his eyes, powerless to stop the chaos that consumed his kingdom. He quickly learned that trust was a weakness, and cruelty was the only path to survival. But the young Ivan IV did not remain powerless for long. He sought solace in books, immersing himself in history and the scriptures, where he found justification for the idea of absolute power. He brooded, he observed, and he seethed. If the boyars wielded power through fear, then he would become fear itself. By the time he was 13, the future Tsar had already developed a taste for blood. In a chilling display of his growing ruthlessness, he ordered the arrest of Prince Andrei Shuisky, one of the most powerful boyars who had tormented him. Before the stunned court, Ivan IV gave the command, and the prince was beaten to death by his guards. The message was clear. The boy was no longer a puppet. He was a ruler, and he would never again be at the mercy of anyone. As Ivan IV grew older, the mask of civility he had learned to wear only barely concealed the darkness within him. He studied the tactics of conquerors, honed his ability to manipulate, and slowly, methodically, prepared for the day when he would seize full control of Russia. When that day finally came, the world would tremble. The boy who had once cowered in the shadows would soon step into the light, not as a savior, but as a storm. Ivan IV had survived his tormented childhood. Now he was ready to rule, not as a mere figurehead, but as an autocrat whose wrath would shake the very foundations of Russia. The boy who had once been powerless had transformed into a man who wielded absolute authority, and he was determined to ensure that no one would ever challenge him again. At the age of 16, Ivan IV made history by declaring himself the first Tsar of all Russia, an act that cemented his supremacy over the nobility. No longer just a grand prince, he had elevated himself to a status beyond that of mere mortals, chosen by God, unanswerable to any earthly power. His reign began with the promise of reform. He modernized Russia's legal system, centralized power, and opened trade with Europe. He expanded the borders of his empire, crushing the Kazan Khanate in a brutal campaign that left over 100,000 corpses in its wake. The streets of Kazan ran red with blood, and the city's population, once thriving, was reduced to a wasteland of the dead and dying. But Ivan IV was not satisfied. He wanted more. At first, his reforms appeared to bring stability. He strengthened the army, curbed the influence of corrupt nobles, and even sponsored great architectural projects, including the legendary St. Basil's Cathedral. But beneath the surface, something was festering. His greatest enemy was not an external force, but the growing paranoia in his own mind. When his beloved wife, Anastasia Romanovna, suddenly fell ill and died in 1560, Ivan IV's world shattered. Convinced that she had been poisoned, he descended into madness, seeing traitors in every shadow. Those closest to him, once trusted advisors, became suspected conspirators overnight. He withdrew from court, retreating into a world of suspicion and rage. The kind and rational ruler who had once sought to improve Russia was gone, replaced by a monster who trusted no one and sought vengeance against all. The boyars, those same nobles who had tormented him as a child, became the first targets of his wrath. He began systematically dismantling their power, creating a new class of enforcers loyal only to him, the Oprichnina, Russia's first secret police. These men, clad in black robes, rode black horses adorned with dog skulls, symbols of their duty to sniff out and destroy the enemies of the Tsar. They roamed the countryside, wielding whips, axes, and fire, burning villages to the ground in the name of loyalty. Any noble who opposed Ivan IV met an unspeakable fate. The purges intensified, and so did the horrors. Families were executed in front of one another, their bodies left to rot as a warning to others. Entire cities were razed on the mere suspicion of disloyalty. Ivan IV's personal methods of torture became increasingly nightmarish, nailing hats to the heads of his victims, impaling nobles on stakes, even forcing men to watch as their wives and daughters were violated before being put to death. Russia was no longer a kingdom, it was a slaughterhouse, and Ivan IV was its butcher. But his thirst for blood was far from quenched. The worst was yet to come. By the 1570s, Ivan IV was no longer just a ruler. He was a god of death, wielding destruction upon his people with the fury of a man who had long abandoned reason. His kingdom was drowning in blood, and his paranoia had become so overwhelming that even his closest allies trembled in his presence. No one was safe, not the boyars, not the peasants, not even the clergy. Ivan IV's most infamous act of brutality came with the massacre of Novgorod in 1570. Convinced that the city's inhabitants were plotting against him, without a shred of proof, he ordered his Oprichnina to descend upon the city like a plague. What followed was one of the most horrifying slaughters in Russian history. The streets became rivers of blood as entire families were dragged from their homes and executed. Women and children were stripped naked and thrown into the icy waters of the Volkhov River, where they either drowned or were mercilessly beaten to death with iron-tipped clubs. Thousands of innocent people perished, their corpses littering the frozen banks as wolves feasted on the remains. The city's archbishop was given a particularly gruesome fate, sewn into the bloody hide of a dead bear and set loose in the wilderness, where he was torn apart by starving dogs. But Novgorod was not the only victim of Ivan IV's unhinged paranoia. Across Russia, his Oprichniki carried out unspeakable acts in his name. They burned entire villages, impaled nobles on stakes, and devised ever more twisted forms of torture to satisfy their master's insatiable bloodlust. Among his favorite punishments was having men slowly roasted over open flames while their families were forced to watch. His personal palace became a dungeon of suffering. It was said that Ivan IV would sit on his throne, laughing, as his victims were tortured before him. He delighted in their agony, sometimes even taking part in the executions himself, wielding his iron staff to smash the skulls of those who displeased him. And yet, his madness was not only confined to his enemies. He turned his wrath upon his own family. One evening in 1581, in a fit of uncontrollable rage, Ivan IV struck his pregnant daughter-in-law so violently that she miscarried. His son, Ivan Ivanovich, furious at his father's brutality, confronted him. But the Tsar, consumed by his own demons, saw only defiance. Without hesitation, he grabbed his iron staff and struck his own son in the skull, caving it in with a single, savage blow. As the young man collapsed, blood pooling beneath him, Ivan IV let out a scream, not of rage but of horror. The weight of what he had done crashed down upon him like an avalanche. He cradled his son's broken body, weeping uncontrollably, begging for forgiveness that would never come. With that single act, Ivan IV had not only destroyed his family, he had sealed the fate of his own dynasty. But fate was not yet finished with him. His final years would be a descent into madness even darker than before. By the 1580s, Ivan IV was no longer just feared. He was a specter of death, a man consumed by his own paranoia and brutality. His body, ravaged by disease, was as twisted as his mind. His skin had turned pale and sickly, covered in festering sores, and his once powerful frame had withered into a shadow of what it had been. But his cruelty remained as sharp as ever. His rage had destroyed his own bloodline. With his eldest son, Ivan Ivanovich, lying dead by his own hands, only his weak and feeble-minded son, Fyodor I, remained as his heir. Fyodor was no warrior, no leader. He was soft, fragile, and wholly unfit to rule. The dynasty that Ivan IV had built with fire and blood was now on the brink of collapse. And yet, even as his body decayed, his thirst for power never waned. His paranoia grew worse, his fits of madness more frequent. He would spend nights digging up corpses, examining their remains, convinced he would find evidence of poison. He trusted no one, not his advisors, not his doctors, not even his own shadow. Some claimed he had been slowly poisoning himself, overdosing on mercury in a desperate attempt to stave off his own demise. Others whispered that he was simply rotting from the inside out. On March 18, 1584, the inevitable finally came. Ivan IV sat hunched over a chessboard, playing on. Of the few games that still brought him pleasure, his bodyguards stood at a distance, too afraid to approach him. Then, without warning, he collapsed. His massive frame crashed to the floor and his breath came in ragged gasps. For a moment, there was silence. Then the realization struck. The Tsar of all Russia was dying. His guards rushed to his side, but there was nothing to be done. The man who had terrorized a nation, who had slaughtered his enemies with his own hands, who had bathed Russia in the blood of thousands, lay gasping for air, his eyes wide with panic. No priest was present. No final blessing was given. And then the breath left his lungs. The room fell still. Ivan IV was dead. His death sent shockwaves through Russia. His weak son, Fyodor I, inherited the throne, but his reign was short-lived. Power quickly slipped into the hands of the ambitious Boris Godunov, and within a few years the Rurik dynasty, which had ruled Russia for over 700 years, was no more. The reign of Ivan IV had been a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions. He had risen from a tormented child to a mighty conqueror, only to descend into madness and self-destruction. He had crushed his enemies, built an empire, and then, in his paranoia, destroyed everything he had worked for. Centuries later, his name would still strike fear into the hearts of those who read of his rule. Some would call him a monster, others would call him a visionary, but all would remember him as Ivan the Terrible.